Good morning, everyone. It's 6:59, so we're going to get started. Welcome to today's virtual breakfast. I'm Christina Corral. I'm the statewide soil health and cover crop educator, and I'm housed up in Lake County. Dr. Cassida is going to talk to us today about potassium and alfalfa.
So thank you for having me here this morning. Hopefully you can all hear me. Today I'm going to talk to you about a something that we go over quite often with alfalfa, and that is the importance of potassium, particularly to alfalfa persistent. So those of us who work in the alfalfa field, we have a saying that it's potassium, potassium, potassium when people are asking us about alfalfa persistence. Um, and the reason for that is that alfalfa is a very heavy feeder for potash compared to a lot of other field crops. And I did a little digging around for this talk and discovered that there's a fair amount of variability about what people will say to use as a base, ranges from 40 to 60 pounds per acre of potash for every ton of dry yield removed. This is going to vary because it depends on the actual potassium percentage in that particular harvest. All right. So there is some range there. But I took an average that's often used in the industry of 58 pounds per acre and created this graph looking at the removal of potash for different yields of forage. The purple line is the alfalfa. This dot represents a good 6 ton per acre yield. The green line is for a perennial grass like orchard grass, and the orange line is for silage corn. And if you're looking at where the dots are for a typical 6 ton yield of alfalfa or grass compared to a typical 10-ton yield of silage corn, you can see the alfalfa is removing a lot more potash. All right. 342 pounds per year is being taken out by your crop and leaving your farm. All right. This is a significant drain on the ability of your plants to succeed at what they're trying to do because potassium is very important for our plants. It is the most abundant cation that we find in plants. It has many, many functions that I'm not going to go into in detail. One of the very, very important ones, though, that's very related to its ability to help plants with persistence is its role in osmotic adjustment. And that basically means that it is helping the plant control water pressure and the movement of water through the plant. Potassium is very important regulating the opening of the stomata in the leaves that let water in and out, and also let carbon dioxide in and out for photosynthesis. It helps maintain the turgor pressure in the plant, which, plants don't have skeletons, so that pressure of the water inside the cells is what actually holds the plant up. It's also a cofactor in many, many enzymes, including some very important ones in photosynthesis and respiration, and also some important ones in protein synthesis, which of course is something we think about a lot when we're dealing with an alfalfa crop. It's involved in nutrient transport throughout the plant, and it increases root growth. But along with all of these things, the most important thing that's related to our title, which is persistence, is that potassium is probably the most important nutrient for stress tolerance in plants. Through its roles that I just mentioned, it helps the plant deal with many things. In the case of alfalfa, one of the really important ones is cold tolerance. So potassium is very much involved in the development of cold hardening in the plants as we're going at this time of year, starting to transition from summer into winter. It's involved with frost and freeze tolerance. One of the big problems we have in persistence of alfalfa is winter kill. All right, we lose a lot of plants over the winter or they are damaged. And having enough potassium available is essential for the plant's ability to resist that winter kill damage. The role in water relations also is very, very important in three things related to water. One is drought tolerance. We know we see more and more of these short droughts. Most people in Michigan are not irrigating their alfalfa, so they are dependent on rainfall. And through its ability to regulate water movement through the stomata, potassium is essential for the plant's ability to remain productive through a drought. Surprisingly, potassium is also helpful in several species of plants at helping them tolerate waterlogging, again, through helping move water in and out of the plant and help it deal with too much water. I was unable to find any research looking at that directly with alfalfa, um, but it is intriguing to me because waterlogging is one of the things that contributes to our winter kill that we see in alfalfa because it's often getting a double whammy of cold temperatures along with saturated soils or ice sheeting. So potassium may also be helping with that. And lastly, if you are irrigating, potassium is salts tend to build up in soils over long-term irrigation, and soil salinity can actually become a problem that again, having the right amount of potassium helps plants deal with that. Importantly, potassium is essential for disease resistance in plants. It helps plants resist back all of the different classifications of diseases, bacteria, fungi, viruses, and nematodes. Some of the mechanisms here is by making sure the plant has a strong stem and cell wall to help block access of those pathogens. And there's also some evidence that um, through control of the stomata, the plants can have some control over entry of the different pathogens. And lastly, insect resistance is also facilitated by potassium because again we get those strong stems and cell walls that helps reduce the feeding of the insects. So all of these things are things that make our plants go away if they get overstressed. So we want to make sure that they have enough potassium there right from the get-go to make sure everything's working properly. Now, in the soil, there's quite a lot of potassium in most soils, but most of it is fixed in an unavailable pool that plants can't get to. So there's also a small available pool and a slightly larger exchangeable pool. Potassium can go back and forth amongst all of these, but the only place the plant can get it is from the relatively small available pool. And this comes from the ultimate source there is released from the parent soil minerals. We also see some K entering the available pool because it's released by the plant itself through root exudates. It also can come back into the soil through biomass additions like plant residues or degradation of roots and tissues. Also through additions such as manure or compost. And lastly, it can come from fertilizer that we add. Now, where do we lose the potassium? Our big loss is that crop harvest in the case of a hayfield. Huge loss due to the harvest of the plant because we're not letting any residue come back to speak of. We're taking everything away and it's leaving. We do lose a little bit of potassium through leaching. It is water soluble. So particularly in a sandy soil that's not holding it very well or a soil low in organic matter, you get more leaching loss. It can leave through erosion. It goes, if you lose soil particles, some potassium is going to go with that. And it can move back into being unavailably fixed into the clay particles. So it might be available at one point and then not available. What do we see in plants if they are deficient in potassium? Everyone looks for the main symptom, which is the classic yellow spots along the leaf edge or tip of the older leaves, as shown in this top picture over here. Um, and unfortunately, that's really easy to confuse with potato leaf hopper damage. So I've included for those with visuals a second picture here of potato leaf hopper damage, and you can see how superficially that looks very similar because you're seeing that discoloration of leaves and ultimately death of the leaves along that leaf tip. All right. Also remember that I just pointed out that if you don't have enough potassium, you're likely to have more potato leaf hopper damage than you would have had if your plants were in good status. So those two things, make sure you know what you're looking at. You don't see an obvious reduced yield. Most of the time, it's more subtle. You may see increased winter kill. You may see not very good productivity during your droughts. You're going to see increased susceptibility to insects and root diseases. All of these things are kind of subtle. They're sort of built up as an overall, like, wow, this stand is really not doing very well. Why is that? And one of the big things that we ultimately will see, and Dr. Aaron Burns and I deal with this a lot, is the first call we get is, why do I have so many weeds in my alfalfa field? Because if the alfalfa is dying out and disadvantaged, the weeds are going to be happy to come in. And one of the very classic things that we see when we start to investigate one of those situations is that the field is going to be too low in potassium. It's not a weed problem, it's a fertility problem that you need to fix first in order to solve that weed problem. So deficiencies tend to be more common when our forage yield is higher. Obviously, that's taking more away. Sandy soils can't hold on to potassium as effectively, and so more likely to be deficient. If there is low soil organic matter helps soils hold on to that available potassium and make it cycle properly. If your soil is compacted or wet, you're also more likely to see some potassium deficiencies. Our optimum levels are lower in sandy soils than they are in loam or clay soil. The optimum level for a sandy soil is 100 to 130 parts per million. For loam or clay soil, it's 120 to 170. That's because the heavier soils are more likely to bind or make the potassium move into the unavailable pool, so you can get by with putting less on a sand. We want you to understand that it is nearly impossible to maintain adequate soil test or potassium in a hayfield if you are not making some kind of addition. That might be fertilizer, it might be other soil amendments like manure, but you can't, it is not possible for even the healthiest soil to replace all that potassium in the time frame that we are asking it to. All right. Hay just removes it too fast. And your soil test potassium is going to drop about 1 parts per million for every 6 to 20 pounds of potash that's removed. All right. And that's quite a range, but that's because it differs with soil types and there's a lot of variables in here. But taking that 6-ton alfalfa yield is going to drop your soil test potassium by 18 to 57 parts per million on your soil test. All right. We also see seasonal changes in soil test potassium. Typically, it's going to be lower in the fall than it is in the spring in a perennial forage, and that's because as the hay is harvested over the season, it can't be replenished in the soil as fast as it's being taken away, so it's going to drop. Um, so I like to have people go out and do their soil testing in the fall because that's likely to be your lowest point. It will recover a little bit over the winter. And for that reason, you really don't want to base your potassium fertilization decisions on your first cut alfalfa, particularly if you're doing it based on a tissue test, because that cutting is probably going to be a little higher in potassium than other cuttings of the year. Whatever you choose, you do want to make sure you test your soils at the same time each year so you're getting a consistent trend over time. I, again, like the fall testing because that's your lowest point, but also it's really important to make sure that you have enough potash going into the winter because of its importance for winter survival. Waiting until the plants are dead in the spring is not a good time to do it. So why don't producers actually add enough potassium to their soils? It can be expensive. The price isn't too bad right now. But about 90% of the potash used in the United States is imported. And we've, seen what happens when you have supply chain disruptions. It can create really volatile price swings. And I think because producers don't see an obvious yield bump from potassium, it's too easy to think, oh, it's expensive. It doesn't matter. I'm not going to put any out this year. But you can quickly deplete your soils. There's also concern from dairy farmers about maintaining a lower potassium level in alfalfa because too much potassium in the diet of a dry dairy cow can actually cause some health problems and lead those animals to be more susceptible to milk fever. So if you're feeding cows, you like to have your forage potassium less than 2% for those dry cows. Unfortunately, 2% potassium is the deficiency threshold for alfalfa. So you really can't make alfalfa low enough to feed to those dry dairy cows without hurting the alfalfa. You need to use something else as a forage for dry dairy cows, like a grass that doesn't need as much potassium. Also, we see a lot of people who are growing what they are promoting as organic hay. You still need to add the potassium back as manure or compost. And here's my last slide. Just a few tips on management considerations for potassium. It's so important to optimize your soil test potassium before the environmental stress occurs. This is not a treatment, all right? If the alfalfa is already damaged, you might get it to move to last a little longer, but really keeping your potassium levels up helps that stand stay in longer. For a hayfield, you want to test it at least every 3 years. If it's high yielding field, maybe every two. You're not going to have to apply more than 300 pounds of potash at any one time. That's the maximum recommended because you can get actually some salt damage if you apply too much at one time. Anything you can do to improve your soil organic matter is going to increase your cation exchange capacity, which is also going to improve your potassium holding capacity. And I'm just going to end with this slide showing some results from a classic study at Purdue where they found that it was also very important when fertilizing with potassium to make sure that you had adequate phosphorus. And I will point out that on this particular study, they deliberately went to a very depleted soil to start with. They were not dealing with a soil that was high in any nutrient at the beginning. But they did find that if they did not put out both P and K, they would have much worse performance of their alfalfa. And just explaining what's in this chart for those of you who are listening, basically, if there's no fertilizer applied, you're going to see steady declines in stands over 5 years. When you put on phosphorus only, you had a little bit better yield, but still you see that decline over time. But if you put on both of them, P and K, you got still a little decline over time, but it was much less. And the last point I'll make here is to show that 2002 on this graph, the last year, was a drought year. And you can see in that drought year how much better the alfalfa did, approximately 2 to 3 times better when it had P and K than when it had no fertilizer or phosphorus only. And with that, I'm going to stop my share.
Right. Okay. So the first question, Kim, is for you. It's from John. He wants you to address boron and does it help in the small amounts to improve the alfalfa stand?
Absolutely. Alfalfa requires boron. There's no doubt about that. It's not every crop actually requires boron fertilization, but alfalfa is definitely one that will benefit from that. The amount needed is very small though. So actually your 5 pounds per acre in the question is actually a little higher than you normally would be applying. Typically, we're only putting out 1 to 2 pounds. So you can buy specially mixed granular fertilizers for alfalfa that have that mixed in. You really can't apply 1 to 2 pounds of fertilizer by itself as a dry fertilizer. The other thing that works really well with boron is applying it as a liquid fertilizer due to the small amount. So that's one that does work really, really well as a foliar application. Definitely worth it, particularly on a sandy soil. Again, sandy soils don't hold nutrients very well. And,
Okay. Before we get to Norm's question, can you answer Williams because it's along those same lines, and he's asking when is the
yeah,
best time to apply the boron?
well, the question is about when's the best time to apply boron for stand establishment. Now, boron is toxic if it is directly in contact with the seed. So what it's important to get your boron, um, corrected in your soil before you plant if you can. Ideally, what we'd like to do is have you do your soil corrections for alfalfa, and then incorporate. Most people in Michigan are probably still planting alfalfa using conventional tillage. And if you can get that fertilizer incorporated before you plant the alfalfa, that's perfect. You do not want to put boron in the seed furrow if you are using no-till. So if you are doing that, the best option is actually to wait till the alfalfa is up and then apply the boron, often as a foliar afterwards. So you can apply it directly to the surface of the ground too. It doesn't need to be um, get on the plant. And then keep it up over the lifetime of the stand. You don't normally have to put it on every year. You might need to only do it every other year.
All right, thank you. So Norman is asking about potassium. Is it retained or returned in any reasonable amounts on a mostly unmanaged pasture with low grazing pressure? For example, by uneaten decomposing matter above ground or drop manure. The pasture has not seen a plow since the mid-90s.
Yeah, absolutely. All of that residue, plant residue that's, dying and being recycled there in the pasture, that potassium is going back into the soil pool, where some of it will be, it's munched on by the microbes. Some of it goes into that available pool. Some of it may still get fixed into the clay particles. That's just something that happens in soils particularly in a clay soil when it's going through wet, dry cycles. It binds onto the potassium. And if you're not selling anything out of that pasture, there's really no way for anything to leave other than through leaching or erosion, which hopefully is not happening in a pasture. But if you're selling even animals or milk or whatever, anything that leaves your system is going to take some potassium with it. So while in a pasture system, your drain is less than in a hayfield, there can still be a drain. Um,
Thank you. Steve's wondering about this year's drought conditions and its effect on our alfalfa and forage crops. Has it affected quality and cuttings?
Well, the drought situation this year has been so uneven around the state. If you're in one of those spots that hasn't had any rain, absolutely it's affected your yields and your cuttings. But we have other parts of the state where the yields have been good and overall, I don't know what to tell you on our overall hay supply. I think there's probably more good sections of the state than there are bad ones. Um, but we also have a very large hay backlog from last year. Last year we had a bumper year for hay. Probably not a whole lot of the alfalfa left, but there's still a lot of grass hay out there for sale from last year. So we're not going to have a hay shortage. We may, as we often have, we may have a shortage of really good hay because we never have enough of that. Because it's hard to make really good hay no matter where you are. But I don't think we're in any particular kind of a generalized crisis situation on hay supply this year. It's definitely bad if for individual farmers if they're in one of those drought areas.
All right. Steve has a follow-up. If we're trying to improve our alfalfa pasture, is there anything else that we can add to improve or vitalize our pasture other than potassium?
Well, that's a good question. I'd say, over my career here at MSU, I've had many, many people contact me about declining alfalfa stands. I don't know if I have ever seen a soil test from a declining alfalfa stand that was not deficient in potassium.
Mhm.
Christina's nodding her head. She must have had a similar experience. So it is by far the most common thing that we see. Now, in some of these marginal lands used for hay, which is not typically where we put the alfalfa, you may also see phosphorus being low. Um, but I'd say in general, the potassium is the big player, and that's why we say potassium, potassium.
Mhm. Yeah. I
I
had the
wish if
per
there was one thing I could tell alfalfa growers that you could do to make your stand last longer is keep up with your potassium. It
Yeah.
is so important. And it's not fancy. It's not dramatic. It's not something that really catches people's attention, but it is so, so important to enabling any perennial plant, actually, especially alfalfa, to be able to live year after year and tolerate all those stresses. I can't underestimate how important that is.
And I'll address that. I have the privilege and opportunity to look at most every single soil sample that goes into the MSU soil um, testing, and I could count on one hand how many samples we see that does not need potassium from any perennial crop.
Mhm.
And I mean, we see just, thousands a year. So potassium is an issue we're dealing with.
Yep.
Okay, Clay's also asking, is there any or anything else we can plant that would scavenge or mine the potassium like buckwheat that would not adversely impact forage?
That's actually an interesting question. And when I was preparing this talk, I actually did some digging through the literature. I was trying to find out, has anyone looked at how improving soil health and things affects potassium cycling? I was remarkably unable to find anything useful for that. Again, I don't, it's not a topic that is trendy for research either. So we basically give the stock answers of, well, if your soil is healthier, you will have more potassium availability, but we don't have details for how that is working. So if we don't have the details for how it's working, it's really hard to make recommendations of, is there a plant that could help make it better? Um, Typically, buckwheat wouldn't be something I would put into my alfalfa stand, though, because buckwheat actually has some toxicity issues for livestock, um, and shouldn't be. You want to be careful. You can feed it to livestock, but you need to be careful. That's a whole nother story.
Mhm. All right. So Bill has a question about mycorrhizal fungi. Is there any that play a significant role in phosphorus uptake in alfalfa? I don't know if he meant phosphorus or
Abs
potassium. I don't know.
Absolutely. Alfalfa is mycorrhizal, and it requires those fungi to be able to effectively take up phosphorus. So we actually quite typically we may see symptoms of phosphorus deficiency in alfalfa where the soil test is adequate, should be adequate, but the thing that is missing is the fungi. And we see that a lot with alfalfa in areas that are waterlogged because the fungi can't survive in waterlogged soil. So if you have a low spot in the field, one of the things that makes the plants go out in that area can actually be phosphorus deficiency because they don't have their friendly fungi to help them. And we we do have researchers working on that problem to learn more about how we can help the alfalfa and the mycorrhizae do their jobs better.
Thank you. If there is no more questions, I think, Steve, we can probably get ready to end it. I do want to remind everyone that you can always join us on several different social media sites. You can join us through Twitter, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. You can follow us on Facebook, and you can go and you can listen to this again if you have more questions or you want to think about some more what was taught today. So go ahead and join us on those platforms. With that, thank you all for coming, and please come back next week with all your questions, and we will do our best to answer those.